So in the Bible, there are multiple forms of, I guess, what you could call a legitimate marriage. So the first one that you would encounter would be in Genesis chapter 2, and this is with Adam and Eve. And Eve is created from Adam's rib, and because of this, she is subservient to him. She obeys him. He is essentially her master, her owner. And this is where you get the idea of one man, one woman. And this is an ideological tale meant to explain, I guess, heteronormative relationships. And we have parallels to this in mythologies across the globe. And so this is what you would call an ideological tale for a normal marriage. But this isn't the only type of marriage within the Bible. You have another type found in, I believe, Genesis chapter 16. And this is with Abraham and his wife Sarah. Sarah is barren, and so Abraham takes her female slave and with her produces his firstborn son, Ishmael. And so using the female slave of your wife was considered a legitimate form of marriage. It produced legitimate offspring. And so Ishmael was a legitimate heir for Abraham through this surrogate named Hagar. And so that is a second legitimate form of biblical marriage. But the wife doesn't necessarily have to be barren for someone to enact this practice. In Genesis 29, Jacob does this. He has two wives, Rachel and Leah, and he takes each of their female slaves, Bilhah and Zilpah, and he also takes them. And I think his actual wives produce like 9 children for him, but he also has another 4 children with their slaves. And so this idea of using your wife's slaves as your own wives to produce more legitimate children, it doesn't have to come from a point of having a barren wife. In this case, both of his wives had already produced children when he began to do this. And this is where the, supposedly the 12 tribes of Israel came from. 4 of the sons who had become heads of tribes came from his slaves. But this idea of multiple wives would bring us to our next type of biblical marriage, and this would be just your typical polygamy. This is where you have one man who has multiple wives. And there was no prohibition against this in the Bible. Many of the men in the Bible have multiple wives, but none have quite as many as King Solomon. King Solomon appears in, I believe, the first book of Kings. He's the son of David, and he is the one who builds the great temple in Jerusalem to Yahweh. And Solomon has 700 wives and 300 concubines. And again, this is a legitimate form of marriage within the Bible. You can have multiple wives as long as you can afford to pay for them. Women are basically property. And so as long as you can buy another woman, then you can have another woman. Now, there's not exactly a limit placed on this, but it's sort of assumed that because Solomon stopped at 700, then so should you. But he, of course, also has 300 concubines. You can have multiple concubines. There's no prohibition against concubines in the Bible. The idea that prostitution is illegal, that's not really what the text says. Prostitution is okay. It is not considered any type of crime. It is a legitimate source of income. The idea that prostitutes are committing adultery, that doesn't really fly because adultery is clearly spelled out. They state what adultery means, and prostitution is not covered by that. Now, the Israelites were obsessed with property rights. And, since women, as I mentioned, were property, then you also had this idea that they could not inherit property. I believe this gets rectified in Deuteronomy, but for the most part, women cannot inherit property because they are property. So you have to have a male heir. You have to have a son to inherit your property. And if you're a man and you do not have a son and you die, now there's a problem. What is to be done with your property? And that brings us to Genesis 38 with the Liveright marriage. And what that means is if you're a man and you die and you have no male heirs, then your brother or your closest male kin is supposed to sleep with your wife until she bears a male child for you. This child would then be considered your legitimate heir, as if it were your child. And this is called the Liveright marriage. A man with his brother's widow is considered a legitimate type of marriage in Genesis 38. So that gives us another type of legitimate marriage in the Bible. Now, men could also take female slaves as their wives, and these would also produce legitimate children. And so any children born to the property of a man would be considered his actual legitimate children. And we see this spelled out quite clearly in Exodus 21. Now, you have a similar arrangement to this with prisoners of war. If a male soldier invades a country and he defeats his enemy and he takes their daughters, not their wives, you want these to be virgin girls. If you take these girls from your enemy, then your spoils of war, your female property that you captured from an enemy nation, that can now become your legitimate wife. And this, of course, would bear legitimate children. There's no prohibition against this. It's noted in Deuteronomy 21 and I believe Numbers 31. It's actually part of their law code where it outlines the proper way to conduct a holy war. And so the children of prisoners of war are legitimate children, and that's a legitimate form of marriage. And since we're talking about Deuteronomy, we need to get into the worst form of marriage. In chapter 22, Deuteronomy tells us that if a man rapes a virgin girl, then she now becomes his property, his wife. She can never leave him. And once she becomes his property, he has to pay her father, her owner, I believe 50 shekels of silver as essentially damages to his property. She was once her father's property, and now this man has essentially purchased through force from the man, so he has to pay the woman's father for damages. And so essentially a rape victim is another legitimate form of marriage in the Bible. Now, if you move on to the New Testament, Paul repeatedly tells us that there's really no purpose to marriage. Marriage is a distraction, and since the world is about to end, according to Paul, then, marriage, wives, children, family is just a distraction from God. And you should ignore these desires and be celibate. And so marriage is frowned upon in the New Testament. You shouldn't even get married unless you absolutely cannot control your sexual urges. Only then can you get married. And even then, that it's kind of frowned upon. So there's no one type of marriage in the Bible. There are multiple types that are all considered to be legitimate forms of marriage within the book.